Welcome back. So, in my last presentation, I gave you my audit findings and my opinion on Policy 3502 and Policy 3501 across three contexts: general due diligence, Ontario legislative compliance, and our New York Stock Exchange listing. The conclusion was that this is a strong template with a handful of specific fixable gaps, not a document that needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. In this presentation, I want to convert that finding into something actionable, which is five recommendations prioritized, each one tied to a specific framework or legal requirement, and each one chosen because it's practical and cost effective rather than aspirational. I'll take them in priority order, starting with the one I consider the most urgent. So, recommendation one, I would replace the British Columbia legal framework with an Ontario and federal one and add a jurisdictional screening clause. This is my highest priority recommendation because it's the one gap that makes the policy legally inaccurate for us the moment we adopt it, rather than merely incomplete. Right now, the related documents and legislation tables in both policies point to British Columbia's Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act and BC's Personal Information Protection Act. Neither applies to us. As a private company headquartered in Toronto, our privacy obligations flow from the Federal Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPERA, because Ontario has no general private sector privacy statute of its own. Concretely, I recommend three things. First, a straightforward first and replace of the legislation citations through both policies, substituting PIPEDA for BC's FIPA and Personal Information Protection Act, wherever policy obligations are described, and removing references to the BC College and Institute Act, which obviously has no bearing on a private corporation. Second, adding a new clause, I would suggest it sits right alongside the existing Section 2, that is access in Policy 3501, that requires a documented jurisdictional applicability screen anytime the company begins operating in, storing data in, or serving customers in a new province, state, or country. Third, specifically screening our business against the new Critical Cyber Systems Protection Act created by Bill C-8, which received royal assent this past June. If any part of our operation touches a federally regulated critical sector, banking, telecommunications, and energy or interprovincial transport, we would be a designated operator under that act, with mandatory cybersecurity program and incident reporting obligations and penalties running as high as $15 million per day for non-compliance. Even if we conclude today that we are outside its scope, documenting that conclusion, revisiting it periodically is now a genuine legal necessity, not a nice to have. On cost, this is almost entirely a legal drafting exercise. It requires outside or in-house counsel time to verify the substitutions and draft the screening clause. But it does not require new technology, new headcount, or new tooling. I would estimate this as a low-cost, high-value fix and one that could reasonably be completed within a single quarter. For recommendation two, I would build a security disclosure and materiality bridge into the incident response section. This is my second priority and it's specific to our New York Stock Exchange listing. Since December 2023, the SEC has required domestic registrants to disclose a material cybersecurity incident on Form 8K under Item 1.05 within 4 business days of determining that the incident is material. Companies must also describe their cybersecurity risk management strategy and governance annually under Item 106 of Regulation SK, including how the board oversees cyber risk. Policy 3502's incident response section already gives us the right operational bones, a named cybersecurity incident response team, a defined activation process, an emergency authority vested in the CISO to contain an active threat. What's missing is the bridge from that operational response into a securities law decision. I'll recommend adding a short subsection that is directly after the existing incident response and activation clause that does four things. It names who is responsible for triggering a formal materiality assessment. So I'll suggest a small disclosure committee comprising the general counsel, the CFO, that is the chief financial officer, and the CISO, which is the chief information security officer. State that for business day clock explicitly measured from the materiality determination requires that determination and its reasoning to be documented, which protects the company if the determination is ever challenged, and confirms that the annual Form 10K cyber governance narrative is prepared jointly by the CISO's Gov office and investor relations or legal, rather than left to whichever department happens to pick it up. On cost again, this is primarily a governance and legal drafting exercise rather than a technology purchase. The main resource committee is convening the disclosure committee and rehearsing the process, ideally through a tabletop exercise, which Policy 3502 already commits to running periodically for operational incident response. So this can piggyback on an exercise that's already budgeted. I'll rank this second rather than first only because recommendation one is a precondition. You cannot correctly access materiality under a legal framework that is misidentified in the first place. Recommendation three, I would shorten the formal policy review cycle from 5 years to annually with defined interim triggers. So I recommend tightening the review cadence as it stands. Policy 3502 commits to formal review only once every 5 years with a vague allowance to update as needed in between. I recommend two changes. First, move the base review cycle to annual, time to coincide with existing annual security awareness training, refresh already required under Section 10. So this doesn't create a new administrative event, it attaches to one that already exists. Second, I'll add an explicit list of interim triggers that force an out of cycle review regardless of where we are in the annual calendar. A material security incident, a new or amended law such as Bill C8, critical systems obligations that we just discussed, a change in stock exchange listing status, or the adoption of a materially new technology category such as generative AI at scale. This recommendation is genuinely low cost. It's a governance calendar change, not a technology or staffing change. And it's because it piggybacks on an existing annual training cycle, the incremental burden on the cybersecurity office is modest. I'd rank it third, important but lower urgency than the two legal compliance items above, since an outdated review date doesn't itself create a compliance breach the way an incorrect legal citation or a missing disclosure process does. Recommendation 4, we publish an explicit framework crosswalk to NIST CSF 2.0 and ISO 27001 for 2022. So I recommend adding a short appendix, 2 or 3 pages would do it, mapping each of the 23 framework domains in Policy 3502 to the relevant function in the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, meaning govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, and to the relevant annex, a control category in ISO 27001. So right now, the board decision notes assets alignment with these frameworks. And having read the policy closely, I believe that alignment is real, but it isn't demonstrated anywhere in the document itself, which means every external party, an auditor, a cyber insurance underwriter, a due diligence team in a future transaction has to reconstruct that mapping by hand. This is genuinely low cost recommendation since it requires no new controls at all. It's a documentation exercise layered on top of a framework that, as I said in the last presentation, already substantively does the work. The benefit is disproportionate to the cost. It materially speeds up every future audit, every insurance renewal, and every diligence exercise this company goes through. Because instead of re-deriving the mapping each time, an external reviewer can simply check it against ours. The fifth and final recommendation would be to extend the existing AI governance provisions and add a post-quantum cryptography roadmap. This is the most forward-looking one, and I've deliberately ranked it last because while it is important, it addresses risk on a longer time horizon than the first four items. Policy 3501 already contains a strong artificial intelligence governance section requiring a privacy and security threshold assessment before AI tools are adopted, banning the entry of confidential or personal information onto unapproved AI tools, and requiring review of AI-generated output. I recommend two extensions. First, formally tier AI used by risk level, drawing on a recognized structure such as NIST AI Risk Management Framework, so that low-risk users, drafting assistants, for example, face a lighter approval path than higher-risk users, such as AI systems that influence a hiring or lending decision. Second, I would add a short subsection to the encryption section of Policy 3502, committing to a post-quantum cryptography migration roadmap, referencing the NIST penalized standards published in 2024 and naming a specific role. I'll suggest the CISO's office, consistent with everywhere else. The CISO is already the named authority responsible for tracking that migration for any data with a long confidentiality horizon, such as research data, employee records, or long-term contracts. Cost here is genuinely modest in the near term. This is a documentation and governance role addition, not a capital project. Though I want to be candid that the eventual technical migration to post-quantum algorithms rather, once national and industry standards mature further, will carry real implementation costs down the road. That longer term cost is exactly why I'm recommending we start the planning and ownership phase now. So while it is cheap, rather than waiting until it becomes an urgent and expensive retrofit. So to bring this together in the order, I would actually sequence them. So first, correct the legal and jurisdictional foundation because everything else depends on getting that right. Second, build the securities disclosure and materiality bridge because it's the most consequential gap specific to our New York Stock Exchange listing. Third, shorten the review cycle so that whatever we fix today doesn't quietly go stale for another 5 years. Fourth, publish the framework crosswalk so our work is auditable and defensible to outside parties. And fifth, extend the AI governance sections provision and start a post-quantum planning, positioning us ahead of both a fast-moving technology curve and a slower-moving but eventually mandatory cryptography transition. Every one of these 5 recommendations is achievable without discarding the underlying policy framework, which, as I said in the first presentation, is genuinely solid. That, to me, is the most encouraging part of this audit. The foundation is sound, and the path to full adequacy for our specific situation is short, well-defined, and realistic to execute within the next 1 to 2 fiscal quarters. Thank you again for your time. See you next.